The knock came at 5 in the morning. Dmitri Polyakov heard it through two closed doors and knew exactly what it meant. His wife stirred beside him, her eyes opening slowly, and then she saw his face. She understood immediately. 25 years of marriage teaches you to read silence. He swung his legs out of bed and reached for his trousers. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, the sound of knuckles against wood echoing through their Moscow apartment. His uniform jacket hung on the chair where he'd left it the night before, the stars on his shoulders catching the dim light filtering through the curtains. Major General, GRU, decorated war veteran. And for the past quarter century, something else entirely. The briefcase sat in the corner near his fishing rod. He'd been carrying that briefcase to GRU headquarters every working day for 2 decades, and it had never felt particularly heavy. Now, walking past it toward the door, it seemed to weigh nothing at all. The photograph of his war medals hung on the wall beside the door, and he paused for just a moment to look at them. Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. He'd earned every piece of metal in that frame. His wife stood behind him now, her hand on his shoulder. She didn't ask any questions because she'd learned years ago not to ask questions. The fishing rod leaned against the wall, its hollow compartment still containing a strip of microfilm from his last dead drop. The KGB officers on the other side of the door had no idea about that particular detail. Not yet. Polyakov opened the door. 3 men in dark suits stood in the hallway, their faces professionally blank. The lead officer held up his identification, though everyone in the room already knew who he was and why he'd come. The metallic click of handcuffs broke the morning silence, cold steel against Polyakov's wrists, and his wife made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a sob. One of the officers picked up the briefcase. Another took the fishing rod. They'd find the microfilm eventually, but by then it wouldn't matter. The information on that film was already in American hands, already being analyzed, already changing the calculations that kept 2 superpowers from destroying each other. Polyakov looked at his wife one final time, memorizing her face, and then walked out into the Moscow dawn. 25 years earlier, this same man had walked into the American embassy and made a decision that would change the Cold War forever. Before we find out how a Soviet general became America's most valuable spy, I want to let you know what this channel is all about. Every day, we bring you real espionage stories. Not Hollywood fiction, but actual operations that shaped his history, the tradecraft, the betrayals, the impossible moral choices that intelligence officers face in the shadows. If you're fascinated by how the world really works behind the classified curtain, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, what you're about to hear about Dmitri Polyakov is just the beginning. The spy stories coming in future episodes will change how you understand everything from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the fall of the Soviet Union. These are the operations your history textbooks left out. All right, back to New York, 1959. Polyakov had just arrived at the Soviet mission to the United Nations, and he was about to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. The city overwhelmed him at first. Manhattan's vertical landscape bore no resemblance to Moscow's sprawling grayness, and the cacophony of American life, the traffic, the advertisements, the casual abundance, created a cognitive dissonance that Polyakov found both fascinating and disturbing. He'd been posted to New York as a military intelligence officer, tasked with monitoring American defense capabilities and cultivating potential sources. Standard GRU work, nothing unusual. But something was changing inside him, a rot that had been growing for years, accelerated by what he saw through his hotel window every morning. Americans walked freely, complained openly, lived without the suffocating paranoia that defined Soviet existence. The contrast gnawed at him. He'd fought in the Great Patriotic War, watched his friends die in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, believed every sacrifice was necessary to build a better future. And then he'd risen through the GRU ranks and seen what the party had actually built. The corruption made him physically sick. Party officials living in luxury while veterans begged for bread. the casual cruelty of Stalin's purges, continuing even after the dictator's death, the lies that permeated every level of Soviet society, the constant surveillance, the fear that poisoned even family dinners. Polyakov had joined the Red Army believing he was defending Russia. He'd ended up defending a system that was devouring Russia from within. His breaking point came during a reception at the Soviet mission. A visiting party official from Moscow got drunk and bragged about his dacha, his imported German car, his access to Western goods that ordinary Soviets could never touch. The man had never served in the war, never fired a weapon, never watched his friends bleed out in the snow. And he was lecturing Polyakov about loyalty to the motherland. That night, Polyakov made his decision. Not impulsively, he wasn't that kind of man, but with the methodical calculation that had made him an effective intelligence officer. He would approach the Americans, he would offer his services, not because he hated Russia, but because he loved it. The party was leading his country towards catastrophe, and someone needed to apply the brakes. The approach happened on a Thursday afternoon in October. Polyakov walked into a bookstore in Midtown that he knew the CIA monitored, bought a copy of the New York Times, and positioned it under his left arm with the front page facing outward as he left the store. Then he walked 3 blocks north, stopped to tie his shoe at a predetermined corner, and continued to Central Park. The recognition signal had been passed. 2 days later, a man sat down next to him on a bench near the pond. The man wore a gray overcoat and carried a newspaper of his own, and for several minutes neither of them spoke. Finally, the American asked if Polyakov knew where the Metropolitan Museum was located. Polyakov replied that he preferred the Natural History Museum himself. The verbal confirmation complete, the American suggested they take a walk. What Polyakov told his new handler over the next hour made the CIA officer's hands shake. This wasn't some low-level functionary offering to sell secrets for cash. This was a GRU major with access to Soviet military planning, weapon systems intelligence, and personnel files on hundreds of Soviet intelligence officers. And he wasn't asking for money. He wanted fishing gear, maybe some tools, enough to justify occasional shopping trips without raising suspicion, but nothing that would make him wealthy or careless. The American asked the obvious question, why? Polyakov's answer was simple and devastating. He'd seen too many good Russians die because of party stupidity, and he refused to watch the next war kill millions more because Moscow and Washington couldn't understand each other's true intentions. He would provide information, accurate information, the kind that prevented miscalculations, the kind that kept the Cold War cold. The CIA didn't believe him at first. How could they? Soviet intelligence had tried dozens of times to plant false defectors, to feed disinformation, to compromise American operations. Polyakov could be a trap, probably was a trap. The agency had lost good officers to similar schemes before, and headquarters was screaming at the New York station to proceed with extreme caution. So they tested him. They asked for specific intelligence, documents that would be difficult to fake, information they could verify through independent channels. Polyakov delivered everything they requested. GRU organizational charts, technical specifications for Soviet missile guidance systems, names and assignments of GRU officers operating under diplomatic cover in Western Europe. Every piece of intelligence checked out. Every document proved authentic. Within 6 months, the CIA realized they had something unprecedented. They gave him the codename Top Hat and established protocols for their ongoing relationship. Dead drops would be located in Central Park, with specific benches and trash receptacles designated by number. Recognition signals would involve newspaper positioning and chalk marks on predetermined lampposts. Meeting schedules would be communicated through shortwave radio broadcasts using one-time pad encryption. The Tradecraft was sophisticated, but not overly complicated, designed to minimize the risk of exposure while maintaining regular contact. Polyakov's posting in New York lasted until 1961, and during those 2 years he provided intelligence that fundamentally reshaped American understanding of Soviet military capabilities. But his real value would emerge after he returned to Moscow, when he would begin operating behind enemy lines in the most dangerous intelligence environment on Earth. His handlers warned him repeatedly about the risks. The KGB's counterintelligence directorate was ruthless, paranoid, and increasingly effective. One mistake would mean execution. His family would be destroyed. Everything he'd worked for would be erased. Polyakov understood the stakes perfectly. He told his handler something that would be repeated in CIA briefing rooms for the next 30 years. He wasn't betraying Russia by working for the Americans. He was saving Russia from the men who'd betrayed everything the war generation had fought for. The party was the enemy. The Americans were simply the lever he could use to counterbalance Moscow's worst impulses. His last meeting in New York took place in April 1961, 3 days before his scheduled return to Moscow. The CIA officer gave him a small package containing his communication equipment, a miniature camera, photographic film that would appear blank under normal chemical processing, and detailed instructions for dead drop locations in Moscow. They also gave him an emergency signal. If he needed to communicate danger immediately, he would submit a recipe to a Soviet sporting magazine. The specific wording would alert his handlers that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Polyakov took the package, shook his handler's hand, and walked away. The CIA officer watched him disappear into the Manhattan crowd and wondered if he'd ever see the Russian general again. The odds weren't good. Most agents operating inside the Soviet Union were caught within 2 years. The few who lasted longer usually got careless, usually made one small mistake that unraveled everything. Polyakov would need to maintain perfect operational security for however long he remained active. Perfect security while photographing classified documents, servicing dead drops, and living a double life under the most intensive surveillance apparatus in human history. But the CIA had no idea what Polyakov was truly capable of. They were about to find out. Moscow welcomed him back with gray skies and colder suspicions than anything New York had offered. GRU headquarters sat on Kodinka Airfield, a massive complex where Soviet military intelligence coordinated operations across the globe, and Polyakov returned to his desk like a soldier returning to the trenches. The rhythm of his work resumed immediately. Intelligence briefings, operational planning, personnel evaluations. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. His first dead drop took place in Sokolniki Park on a Sunday morning in June. The hollow stone sat near a specific bench that his CIA handlers had identified months earlier, and Polyakov approached it with a newspaper under his arm and a racing heartbeat beneath his uniform. The stone looked like any other piece of Moscow landscaping, completely unremarkable, which was precisely the point. He knelt to tie his shoe, his fingers brushing against the rough surface, and in one smooth motion lifted the stone and deposited a small metal cylinder containing microfilm. The entire exchange took less than 5 seconds. The film contained photographs of 12 GRU documents detailing Soviet electronic warfare capabilities, Chinese border deployments, and a preliminary assessment of American military strength in Southeast Asia. It represented the first of thousands of document transfers that would continue for the next 2 decades, and it established the pattern that would define Polyakov's tradecraft. He never took unnecessary risks. He never got greedy. He photographed only what he could access through normal work channels, never requisitioned files that might raise questions, and always maintained the appearance of a loyal Soviet officer doing his job efficiently but not obsessively. The CIA's Moscow station retrieved the dead drop that night and immediately recognized the intelligence value. These weren't minor tactical details or dated historical information. These were current operational documents that revealed Soviet military thinking at the highest levels. And Polyakov was positioned to provide this kind of intelligence continuously for as long as he remained undetected. The risk-reward calculation was extraordinary. Polyakov's next innovation came 6 months later, when he began using his fishing hobby as operational cover. He'd always loved fishing, the patience it required, the solitude it offered, the way it gave him space to think. And now he transformed his favorite pastime into an intelligence operation. He purchased a custom fishing rod with a hollow chamber built into the handle, large enough to conceal film canisters, but subtle enough to pass casual inspection. Then he began taking weekend fishing trips to lakes outside Moscow, always alone, always with his special rod. The dead drop mechanics were elegant. Polyakov would park near a predetermined location, walk to the water's edge with his fishing gear, and spend several hours actually fishing. This wasn't just cover. He genuinely fished, caught actual fish, maintained the appearance of a hobbyist enjoying his recreation time. But at a specific moment, usually while moving between fishing spots, he would pass near a designated transfer point. A tree stump, a particular rock formation, an abandoned dock piling, and in one fluid motion he'd extract the film canister from his fishing rod and deposit it in the hiding place. CIA officers would retrieve the material hours or days later, always maintaining sufficient separation to prevent any observer from connecting Polyakov to the dead drop. The system worked flawlessly for years because it relied on a simple truth. Soviet surveillance focused on suspicious behavior, and there was nothing suspicious about a middle-aged general who liked to fish alone on weekends. The KGB had far more interesting targets to monitor than a decorated war veteran with impeccable party credentials who spent his free time staring at a lake. But Polyakov's most sophisticated tradecraft involved his photographic techniques. The special film that CIA had provided required specific camera settings and lighting conditions, and any deviation from the exact parameters would render the images useless, or, worse, partially visible under normal processing. This created both security and risk. Security because Soviet technicians who might intercept the film would develop nothing but blank reels. Risk because Polyakov had to master the technical requirements perfectly, with no room for error and no opportunity to practice openly. He solved the problem by studying photography manuals, ostensibly to improve his personal photo collection, and by building a small darkroom in his apartment under the pretense of developing family pictures. His wife found the new hobby slightly odd, but didn't question it. Polyakov had always been methodical about his interests, and developing film seemed like a natural extension of his organized personality. She had no idea that her husband was photographing classified GRU documents in their bathroom and processing the images using chemicals that would self-destruct the evidence if exposed to normal light. The volume of intelligence he provided became staggering. By 1965, CIA analysts estimated that Polyakov had delivered material equivalent to 15 filing cabinets worth of documents. By 1970, that number had doubled. The information covered Soviet military doctrine, weapons development, intelligence operations, and political assessments. More importantly, it revealed Soviet weaknesses, fears, and strategic vulnerabilities that American planners had only guessed at previously. His reporting on the Sino-Soviet split proved particularly valuable. Throughout the 1960s, tensions between Moscow and Beijing escalated from ideological disagreement to armed border clashes, and American intelligence struggled to assess whether the conflict was genuine or elaborate theater designed to deceive the West. Polyakov provided the answer. He delivered GRU assessments of Chinese military capabilities, reports on border incidents that Moscow kept secret, and internal party discussions about the possibility of preemptive nuclear strikes against Chinese facilities. The intelligence was unambiguous. The split was real, deep, and potentially exploitable. Henry Kissinger received briefings based on Polyakov's intelligence before his secret trip to China in 1971, and the information fundamentally shaped American strategy. Nixon's opening to Beijing wasn't just bold diplomacy. It was calculated policy based on verified intelligence that Moscow and Beijing were genuinely hostile, that triangular diplomacy could work, and that the United States could leverage Soviet fears of encirclement to achieve strategic advantages in both relationships. Polyakov's reporting made that possible. But even as his intelligence output peaked, his personal compensation remained modest. The CIA regularly offered increased payments, better support, arrangements to move money into Western accounts. Polyakov refused every enhancement. He accepted approximately $3,000 per year in tools and equipment, Black & Decker power tools for home repairs, fishing gear to maintain his cover hobby, a shotgun for hunting trips that doubled as additional operational cover. Nothing excessive. Nothing that would require explanation or attract attention. His handlers found this behavior remarkable and slightly frustrating. Most high-value assets expected substantial financial compensation, viewing espionage as a business transaction. Polyakov treated the relationship differently. He wanted assurance that his intelligence was reaching decision-makers, that it was making a difference, that his risk was producing results that justified the danger he faced daily. Money was irrelevant. Impact was everything. This attitude transformed his relationship with CIA handlers from a typical agent-officer dynamic into something more collaborative. By the mid-1970s, Polyakov was essentially running his own operation, choosing what intelligence to collect, determining when and how to pass information, and advising his handlers on tradecraft improvements based on his observations of Soviet counterintelligence capabilities. They stopped treating him as an asset who needed managing and started treating him as a colleague who needed supporting. One of his handlers later described it as working with a teacher rather than an informant. Polyakov understood intelligence work at a level most CIA officers only aspired to reach, and his insights into Soviet operations revealed gaps in American understanding that years of technical collection couldn't address. He explained how GRU recruiting worked, how Moscow Center assessed foreign intelligence services, where Soviet operations were most vulnerable to Western penetration. He wasn't just providing documents. He was providing context, analysis, and strategic understanding. The relationship deepened in ways that violated standard protocols, but improved operational security. Polyakov began signaling his availability for contact through coded personal advertisements in Soviet newspapers. His handlers responded with radio broadcasts using prearranged frequencies. They developed a shared vocabulary of operational terms that sounded innocuous to outsiders, but conveyed precise instructions to each other. The communication became more efficient, more secure, and more trusting. But trust created its own dangers. The longer Polyakov operated successfully, the more dependent American intelligence became on his reporting. Analysts incorporated his information into assessments that shaped presidential decisions. Military planners relied on his technical data to counter Soviet weapons development. Diplomats used his insights to navigate negotiations with Moscow. The entire American intelligence apparatus had built a structure that rested on one man's ability to avoid detection in the world's most dangerous operating environment. And beneath that structure, invisible to nearly everyone involved, a crack was forming. In 1979, an FBI agent named Robert Hanssen walked into a Soviet diplomatic facility and made his own approach. Unlike Polyakov, Hanssen wanted money, lots of money, and he had something valuable to trade. He had access to FBI counterintelligence files, including information about Soviet officials cooperating with American intelligence. He typed out a short list of names on his office typewriter, placed the list in an envelope, and handed it to his new Soviet handler. Dmitri Polyakov's name was on that list. But in Moscow, the GRU didn't immediately act on Hanssen's information. The reasons remained murky even decades later when Russian officials discussed the case. But the most likely explanation involved bureaucratic rivalry between the GRU and KGB. Hanssen had contacted the KGB, not the GRU, and the KGB wasn't eager to hand its sister service a major counterintelligence victory without extracting some advantage for itself. Soviet intelligence services competed viciously for resources, prestige, and political influence, and even a confirmed mole in their ranks could become a pawn in that internal struggle. So they watched Polyakov. They began building a case file, collecting evidence, documenting his movements and contacts. But they didn't arrest him. Not yet. They wanted the operation to be perfect, the evidence to be overwhelming, the political benefit to be maximized. And this delay, this calculated patience, gave Polyakov 3 more years of operation, 3 more years of intelligence collection, 3 more years of preventing strategic miscalculations that could have sparked the nuclear war he was desperately trying to avoid. He had no idea the sword was already hanging over his head, or that the rope holding it was fraying faster than anyone suspected. The American embassy's radio transmissions reached Moscow on shortwave frequencies that anyone with the right equipment could monitor, but the broadcasts sounded like nothing more than random number sequences to casual listeners. Polyakov knew better. He'd memorized the one-time pad that let him decrypt the messages, and on autumn evenings he would sit in his apartment with a small radio receiver, listening to sequences that told him when and where to service the next dead drop. The year 1980 brought subtle changes that troubled his operational instincts. GRU counterintelligence had intensified document security protocols, installing new tracking systems for classified materials and conducting random audits of file access. Nothing specifically targeted him, but the general pressure was increasing across the entire organization. The KGB's paranoia about American intelligence penetrations had infected every corner of Soviet security services, and the GRU was responding with enhanced internal investigations. Polyakov adapted carefully. He reduced his collection frequency, photographed fewer documents, and relied more heavily on his exceptional memory to provide verbal reports through coded messages. His photographic technique had always been meticulous, but now he became obsessive about eliminating trace evidence. He cleaned his apartment's darkroom more thoroughly, disposed of chemical containers more carefully, and varied his fishing trip patterns to avoid establishing predictable routines. But in September 1980, everything changed. Polyakov received orders to return to Moscow permanently from his posting in New Delhi, where he'd been serving as a military attaché. The recall wasn't presented as disciplinary or suspicious. He was simply being reassigned to headquarters for senior administrative duties. A normal career progression for a general approaching retirement age, except the timing felt wrong, and the accompanying paperwork contained subtle irregularities that made Polyakov's operational radar scream warnings. He had 72 hours to pack his affairs and return to Moscow. Not enough time to establish secure communication with his handlers. Not enough time to execute proper security protocols. Just enough time to wonder if this was the end, if someone had discovered his secret, if the next knock on his door would be his last. The flight back to Moscow felt interminable. Polyakov sat in the first-class cabin, reserved for senior officers, watching clouds pass beneath the aircraft, and calculated his options. He could defect. The Americans would certainly accept him, provide new identity, ensure comfortable retirement in the West. But defection meant abandoning his wife, his children, his entire life in Russia, and it meant losing any future opportunity to provide intelligence. If his recall was just routine reassignment, if his fears were simply operational paranoia, then defecting would destroy years of carefully built access for nothing. He decided to return, to see what happened, to trust his tradecraft and his luck. Moscow Center assigned him to administrative duties as promised, but the work felt like a cage. Instead of collecting operational intelligence and planning GRU activities, he reviewed personnel files and wrote efficiency reports. Instead of traveling abroad on assignments that provided cover for dead drops, he commuted from his apartment to his office and back again. And most troubling of all, his access to sensitive documents was quietly restricted. Nothing dramatic, just subtle barriers that prevented him from seeing the kind of intelligence his CIA handlers desperately needed. His handlers noticed the change immediately. The dead drops continued sporadically, but the intelligence quality declined. Polyakov was still trying to operate, still attempting to provide value, but he no longer had access to the material that made him the crown jewel of CIA operations. And worse, he couldn't explain why. His coded messages were brief, cryptic, and increasingly worried. The CIA faced an agonizing decision. Was Polyakov compromised? Should they activate his emergency extraction protocols? Or was this just bad luck, a career reassignment that happened to coincide with organizational changes at GRU headquarters? They had no way to know for certain, and the wrong choice could either destroy a valuable asset or leave him exposed to Soviet counterintelligence. They chose to wait, to monitor, to hope Polyakov could navigate whatever was happening and restore his access. It was a calculated gamble based on incomplete information and wishful thinking. Intelligence work often came down to exactly that kind of choice, and this time they guessed wrong. The silence began in early 1981. Polyakov missed a scheduled dead drop, then another, then a third. His handlers tried every established communication method: radio broadcasts, newspaper signals, chalk marks at predetermined locations. Nothing worked. The contact simply stopped, as if Polyakov had vanished from Moscow entirely. Except they knew he hadn't vanished. They knew he was still in the city, still going to GRU headquarters, still maintaining the appearance of a loyal Soviet general. But he wasn't communicating with them, and they couldn't determine why. The explanations ranged from hopeful to horrifying. Maybe he'd been denied leave and couldn't travel to dead drop locations. Maybe Soviet surveillance had become too intensive and he was waiting for security to relax. Maybe he'd simply decided the risk had become too great and was quietly ending the relationship on his own terms. Or maybe he'd been arrested, interrogated, turned, and was now being run by Soviet counterintelligence as bait to identify his CIA contacts in Moscow. That last possibility terrified CIA officers working Russian operations. If Polyakov had been compromised and flipped, then approaching any of his known dead drop sites could lead directly to arrest. The Moscow station chief ordered a complete stand-down of attempts to contact Polyakov, effectively abandoning him in place while they assessed the situation. It was the correct operational decision and the worst possible human outcome. But Polyakov wasn't just another name in a case file. He was a man who'd risked everything for 20 years, who'd provided intelligence that prevented miscalculations and kept the peace, who'd trusted CIA promises of support and protection. And now he was alone in Moscow with no communication, no help, and no way to signal whether he needed emergency extraction. The distress signal arrived in 1984, hidden in the most unexpected place. A Soviet sporting magazine published a recipe for preparing coot, a waterfowl that hunters sometimes shot but rarely ate because the meat tasted terrible without extensive preparation. The recipe itself was unremarkable except for one specific phrase in the instruction list. Polyakov had included the exact wording they'd agreed upon 23 years earlier in New York, the emergency code that meant his situation had become critical. CIA cryptographers verified the signal immediately. The phrasing was too specific to be coincidental, the placement in that particular magazine too precise to be random. Polyakov was in trouble. He needed help, and there was absolutely nothing the CIA could do for him. He was behind the Iron Curtain, surrounded by KGB surveillance, operating in the most hostile intelligence environment on Earth. Even if they'd wanted to mount an extraction operation, even if they'd been willing to risk an international incident, they had no way to reach him securely. The coot recipe was a cry for help that couldn't be answered, a message that confirmed his exposure without offering any solution. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Aldrich Ames was drinking his way through a personal crisis that would cost Polyakov his life. Ames worked in CIA counterintelligence, the division responsible for protecting agency secrets and identifying foreign penetrations of American intelligence. He had access to virtually every classified operation CIA was running against Soviet targets, and he was desperate for money. His wife was expensive. His lifestyle was expensive. His salary was inadequate. And in April 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and offered to sell everything he knew. Not just a few documents, not just tactical intelligence, everything. He provided the Soviets with complete lists of CIA assets operating inside the USSR, including real names, operational details, and communication protocols. It was the most damaging compromise in CIA history, and one name at the top of Ames's list was Dmitri Polyakov. The information from Ames confirmed and expanded what Hanssen had provided 6 years earlier, giving Soviet counterintelligence everything they needed to build an airtight case. The GRU arrested Polyakov in March 1986, taking him from his apartment at dawn, just as he'd always known they eventually would. The interrogation lasted months, but Polyakov offered little cooperation. He'd spent his entire career preparing for this moment, mentally rehearsing how he would handle capture, deciding in advance what he would say and what he would protect. The trial was brief, secret, and predetermined. A military tribunal convicted him of high treason, espionage, and betraying the Soviet Union to the enemy. The sentence was death. The execution took place in 1988 at an undisclosed location, probably Lubyanka prison in Moscow, probably by a single gunshot to the back of the head. Soviet authorities were usually secretive about espionage executions, but in 1990 they made an exception. Pravda published a brief notice confirming that General Dmitri Polyakov had been convicted of spying for the United States and had been executed 2 years earlier. The announcement served multiple purposes. It warned other potential traitors about the consequences of betrayal. It demonstrated Soviet competence in counterintelligence, despite obvious failures. And it provided psychological closure for the GRU officers who'd worked alongside Polyakov for decades, never suspecting his secret life. The man they'd trusted, respected, and promoted had been working for the enemy all along. The betrayal cut deep into organizational culture and prompted years of internal investigations. Back in the United States, CIA officers who'd worked with Polyakov received the news with grief and rage. They'd known the risks intellectually, but confirmation of his death transformed abstract danger into concrete loss. And beneath that immediate emotion lay a more disturbing question. How had the Soviets identified Polyakov? His tradecraft had been nearly perfect. His operational security was extraordinary. Something else had gone wrong, something beyond his control. The mole hunt intensified throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. CIA counterintelligence knew they had a major penetration somewhere in American intelligence services. Too many assets were being arrested. Too many operations were failing. Too many carefully protected secrets were somehow reaching Moscow Center. But identifying the mole was proving almost impossible. Hundreds of people had access to classified information about Soviet operations, and narrowing the suspect pool required painstaking analysis of precisely what intelligence had been compromised and when. The breakthrough came in 1993 when CIA investigators finally focused on Aldrich Ames. His spending patterns were suspicious. His lifestyle exceeded his salary by ridiculous margins. His access to Soviet operations matched the pattern of compromises perfectly. In February 1994, FBI agents arrested Ames outside his home in Virginia, and the debriefing that followed revealed the full extent of his treachery. He'd betrayed virtually every CIA asset in the Soviet Union. More than 10 people were dead because of him, with Polyakov being the most senior casualty. The damage to American intelligence operations was incalculable, requiring years of rebuilding and leaving gaps in coverage that would take decades to fill. And the human cost, the agents who'd trusted CIA protection and died because an alcoholic bureaucrat needed money for his expensive wife, left scars that never fully healed. For 7 years, the intelligence community believed Ames was the mole responsible for Polyakov's death. The timeline matched, the access matched, the confession matched. Case closed. Except pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit quite right. Some compromises predated Ames's espionage by several years. Some information that reached Moscow hadn't been available to Ames at all. Someone else had also been betraying American secrets, operating independently, causing parallel damage. I have to pause here and ask you something. Dmitri Polyakov spent 25 years risking his life every single day, not for money, but because he believed he was preventing nuclear war. He was protecting his country by helping its enemy. And he was betrayed by 2 separate moles in the very agencies he was trying to help, one in 1979, another in 1985. If you were a CIA officer who worked with Polyakov, who trusted him, who considered him a friend and a hero, how would you live with knowing that your own colleagues sold him out, Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how you'd process that kind of betrayal. Here's what happened next. In February 2001, FBI agents arrested Robert Hanssen in a Virginia park where he was servicing a dead drop for his Russian handlers. The arrest ended a 22-year espionage career that had cost the lives of multiple American assets and done catastrophic damage to U.S. intelligence operations. During his interrogation, Hanssen admitted something that shocked investigators who thought they understood the full story. He'd identified Dmitri Polyakov to the Soviets in 1979, 6 years before Ames began his own espionage. The revelation meant that Polyakov had been operating under a death sentence for years without knowing it. The Soviets had his name, his position, his operational details since 1979, but they'd chosen not to act immediately. They'd watched him, they'd collected evidence, they'd waited until they had everything they needed to make the arrest, trial, and execution absolutely certain. That explained the 1980 recall to Moscow, the restricted access, the administrative reassignment. The GRU had been slowly closing the trap, building their case methodically, ensuring there would be no escape. The double betrayal was almost unprecedented in intelligence history. Two American moles, working independently for different reasons, both happened to expose the same high-value Soviet asset. Hanssen did it first, providing the initial identification in 1979. Ames did it again in 1985, confirming and expanding what Hanssen had already revealed. Together, they ensured that Polyakov had no chance of survival, that Soviet counterintelligence had redundant confirmation of his guilt, that his execution was inevitable. The counterintelligence failures that allowed both Ames and Hanssen to operate undetected for so long forced fundamental reforms across American intelligence services. The CIA and FBI implemented new internal security measures, enhanced polygraph protocols, and established better information sharing between agencies. They created systems to detect unusual financial activity among cleared personnel, to monitor access to classified information more carefully, and to identify behavioral indicators that might suggest espionage. But all the reforms in the world couldn't bring back Dmitri Polyakov or the other agents who died because of insider betrayals. The families suffered their own aftermath. Polyakov's wife and children faced immediate persecution after his arrest. They lost their apartment, their party privileges, and their social status. They became pariahs in Soviet society, relatives of a traitor, untouchables contaminated by association. The KGB interrogated them repeatedly, searching for evidence that they'd known about his espionage, but found nothing. Polyakov had kept his secret absolutely, protecting his family from complicity even while exposing them to consequence. Inside CIA, Polyakov became a symbol of both intelligence triumph and catastrophic failure. His case was studied in training programs as an example of perfect tradecraft and devastating vulnerability. Officers learned how he'd maintained operational security for 25 years, how he'd serviced dead drops without detection, how he'd built trust with his handlers while remaining absolutely professional. They also learned how insider threats could destroy even the best operations, how human weakness could undo decades of careful work, how the intelligence game always carried lethal stakes. The debate about Polyakov's ultimate motivation continued long after his death. Some former KGB officers suggested he'd been a triple agent, controlled by Soviet counterintelligence, and used to feed disinformation to the Americans. The theory was plausible in abstract. Soviet intelligence services had run controlled opposition operations before, allowing apparent moles to operate while secretly managing their intelligence output. Maybe Polyakov's entire operation had been an elaborate deception designed to mislead CIA about Soviet capabilities and intentions. But the officers who actually worked with Polyakov dismissed those theories completely. Sandy Grimes, who helped hunt down Aldrich Ames and spent years analyzing Soviet operations, stated flatly that Polyakov was genuine. His intelligence had been verified through multiple independent sources. His reports had proven accurate repeatedly. His information had shaped policies that demonstrably worked. If he'd been controlled opposition, the Soviets had somehow managed to feed the CIA accurate strategic intelligence for 25 years while pretending to be fooled. That didn't make operational sense. James Woolsey, who served as CIA director in the 1990s, put it more simply. Polyakov's intelligence had kept the Cold War from becoming hot. His information had prevented miscalculations that could have led to nuclear confrontation. His insights into Sino-Soviet tensions had enabled the diplomatic opening to China that transformed global politics. Whatever his ultimate personal motivations, whatever moral calculations he'd made to justify working for the enemy, the practical result was that he'd saved lives, possibly millions of lives, possibly civilization itself. The strategic impact of his intelligence was difficult to overstate. During the Vietnam War, American military planners used his reporting on Soviet weapon systems to develop countermeasures against equipment Moscow was providing to Hanoi. During arms control negotiations, U.S. diplomats relied on his assessments of Soviet nuclear capabilities to craft realistic treaty proposals. During the various Middle East crises, American intelligence understood Soviet intentions partly because Polyakov provided insight into Moscow's strategic thinking. The intelligence didn't just fill gaps in knowledge, it fundamentally shaped how the United States navigated its relationship with the Soviet Union across 2 crucial decades. And he did all of that for fishing gear, for power tools, for hunting equipment that justified his cover activities but never made him wealthy or comfortable. He took the risk because he believed it was necessary, because he'd seen too many good Russians die for bad reasons, because he thought someone needed to apply rationality to the insanity of nuclear brinksmanship. He wasn't naive about the Americans. He knew they were pursuing their own interests, but he calculated that American interests in avoiding nuclear war aligned with his own interest in preserving Russia, even if that meant betraying the party that claimed to represent Russia. The philosophical paradox at the center of his story fascinates intelligence historians. Polyakov was simultaneously a loyal patriot and a committed traitor. He loved his country while betraying its government. He worked for his enemy while trying to save his homeland. The contradiction would be irreconcilable except for his fundamental conviction that the party and Russia were not the same thing, that loyalty to one could require betrayal of the other, that true patriotism sometimes demanded working against your own side. His execution site was never publicly disclosed. The GRU presumably buried him in an unmarked grave, denying him even the minimal dignity of a known resting place. His family scattered after his death, some leaving Russia entirely, some disappearing into provincial anonymity. The apartment where he'd photographed classified documents was reassigned to another officer. The fishing rod with its hollow compartment was probably destroyed as evidence, incinerated along with thousands of pages of interrogation records and trial transcripts. The Soviet Union worked hard to erase him from memory, but they couldn't erase what he'd accomplished. By the time they executed him, in 1988, the Cold War was entering its final phase. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms were accelerating Soviet collapse. The Berlin Wall would fall within 18 months. The USSR itself would dissolve within 3 years. And the policies that managed that transition without nuclear catastrophe, the arms reduction agreements, the diplomatic frameworks, the strategic understanding between superpowers, all bore traces of intelligence that Polyakov had provided years earlier. He didn't live to see the Soviet Union fall. He died still believing he'd failed, still trapped in the system he'd spent his life trying to counterbalance. But his intelligence had already done its work. The information he'd provided was already embedded in American strategic calculations. The insights he'd offered about Soviet weakness and Chinese tensions had already shaped diplomatic realities that Moscow couldn't undo. His contribution to history was complete, even before his execution. A declassified CIA retrospective published in 1998 evaluated Polyakov's career with clinical precision. The document runs to 73 pages and includes detailed assessments of his intelligence production, operational security, strategic impact, and ultimate compromise. The conclusions are unambiguous. General Dmitri Fyodorovich Polyakov was the most valuable human intelligence source the United States recruited during the Cold War. His reporting was consistently accurate, strategically significant, and operationally sustainable. His tradecraft was nearly flawless. His motivation was genuine. His contribution was irreplaceable. The report also acknowledges the failures that cost him his life. American counterintelligence should have detected Hanssen earlier, should have caught Ames sooner, should have implemented security protocols that made insider betrayal more difficult. The agencies that Polyakov risked everything to help failed to protect him from their own internal corruption. That failure haunts everyone who worked Soviet operations during that era. Current intelligence officers study his case as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration because he demonstrated what patient, careful, morally motivated espionage could accomplish. Warning because he proved that even perfect tradecraft can't protect against insider betrayal. His story teaches operational excellence while acknowledging operational limits. It celebrates human intelligence collection while mourning human cost. It's both victory and tragedy, success and failure, heroism and loss. The CIA maintains a memorial for officers killed in the line of duty, a wall of stars where each star represents one person who died serving American intelligence. Polyakov has no star on that wall because he wasn't a CIA officer. He was a foreign national who volunteered his services and paid the ultimate price. But in the hearts of officers who worked with him, who received his intelligence, who understood what he accomplished and what he sacrificed, he deserves recognition alongside any decorated hero. His codename, Top Hat, was officially retired after his death, never to be reused. That's standard practice for agents who are killed, a small gesture of respect in an industry that rarely pauses to acknowledge its casualties. The case files are classified at the highest levels, accessible only to personnel with specific need-to-know clearances. The operational details remain secret decades after the events that they document, but the broad outlines of his story have emerged through declassification, through memoirs of retired officers, through interviews with people who knew him. And what emerges is a picture of a man who made an impossible choice and lived with its consequences for 25 years. A man who believed that preventing nuclear war justified any personal risk. A man who loved his country enough to betray its government. A man who understood that sometimes loyalty requires betrayal, that sometimes patriotism demands treason, that sometimes saving your homeland means working for its enemy. The fishing rod still exists somewhere, probably in a GRU evidence vault or a museum basement. The hollow compartment that concealed microfilm for 2 decades sits empty now, its secrets long since extracted and analyzed and incorporated into history. But the intelligence that passed through that compartment shaped events that continue resonating today. The diplomatic opening to China that Polyakov's reporting facilitated transformed global economics and politics for generations. The arms control framework that his intelligence supported helped manage nuclear weapons into the post-Cold War era. The prevention of strategic miscalculation that his information enabled kept civilization from destroying itself during the most dangerous decades in human history. His final contribution was involuntary, but no less significant. His betrayal by Ames and Hanssen forced intelligence reforms that improved American security for decades afterward. His death prompted questions about loyalty, oversight, and internal security that agencies needed to confront. His sacrifice, because that's ultimately what it was, even though he didn't choose martyrdom, reminded everyone working in intelligence that the stakes were real, the danger was permanent, and the cost of failure was measured in human lives. The irony is that Polyakov probably saved more lives through his espionage than he ever did as a Soviet general. His military career was distinguished but conventional. His intelligence career was extraordinary and transformative. He fought in World War II defending Russia from invasion. He fought in the Cold War defending Russia from itself. Both wars were necessary. Both required courage. But the second war was lonelier, more dangerous, and ultimately more consequential. There's no grave to visit, no monument to honor, no public acknowledgement of what he accomplished. The Soviet government executed him as a traitor. The Russian government still considers him a traitor. Official history in Moscow treats him as a criminal who betrayed his country for American money. A simplistic narrative that ignores his actual motivation and misunderstands his genuine patriotism. But among the intelligence officers who know the real story, who understand what he did and why he did it, who appreciate the magnitude of his contribution and the depth of his sacrifice, Dmitri Polyakov is remembered as something else entirely. He was the spy who kept the Cold War cold, the general who prevented the apocalypse, the patriot who betrayed his government to save his country, the fisherman whose hollow rod contained the keys to strategic stability, the teacher who educated American intelligence about Soviet realities, the symbol of both espionage's potential and its vulnerability, the man who made an impossible choice and lived with it until it killed him. His name was Dmitri Fyodorovich Polyakov. He was born in 1921 in Ukraine. He fought in the Great Patriotic War with courage and distinction. He rose to the rank of Major General in Soviet military intelligence. And for 25 years, he provided information to the United States that helped prevent the nuclear war he feared above everything else. They executed him in 1988. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The weapons he warned about were never used. The war he tried to prevent never happened. And that's his legacy, not the medals on his uniform, not the position he achieved in GRU, not the documents he photographed or the dead drops he serviced. His legacy is everything that didn't happen because he took the risk. That's what a real spy does. Not the Hollywood version with car chases and gadgets. The patient, methodical, dangerous work of one man with a conscience standing between two superpowers, trying to keep them from destroying everything. That's a true story.